Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Rachel always believed that some friendships were meant to last forever. She and Sophie had built their lives side by side, turning late-night study sessions into business meetings and childhood dreams into reality. Their company, a thriving event-planning business, had become the heartbeat of their success, and together they had conquered every challenge life had thrown their way. But no amount of success could have prepared Rachel for the ghost of her past that resurfaced on an ordinary afternoon at the park. She had been sitting on a wooden bench, scrolling through her phone while waiting for a meeting, when a familiar voice called her name. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but when she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, Daniel. The boy she had once loved in high school, the one who had left without a word, vanishing into the world as if he had never existed. His presence was a storm she hadn't expected, and as he smiled at her with that same charming ease, she felt herself slipping into memories she had long buried. They talked for hours, laughter filling the space between them like old times. Daniel spoke of his travels, the opportunities he had chased, and the life he had built since leaving town. Rachel listened, fascinated by the man he had become. There was something intoxicating about reconnecting with a past love, something that made the air between them thick with nostalgia and longing. When the evening grew colder, Daniel suggested they continue their conversation at her place. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. It was just one night, she told herself. A harmless slip into the past. But the moment he stepped inside her apartment, she felt the walls of time closing in. The night unfolded like a delicate dance, old feelings reigniting, words turning into whispers, and barriers crumbling under the weight of the inevitable. In the dim glow of her living room, she convinced herself that it was nothing more than a moment stolen from time. But when morning came, reality settled heavily on her chest. Daniel left with a kiss on her forehead and a promise to call, but deep down, Rachel knew better. Some people were not meant to stay. She told herself it didn't matter, that it was just a lapse in judgment. Yet, as she sat in her office later that day, watching Sophie excitedly discuss their upcoming projects, guilt clawed at the edges of her heart. It wasn't the night itself that unsettled her, but the feeling that something was about to change, something she couldn't quite name, but feared nonetheless. Sophie never believed in love at first sight, but there was something about Daniel that felt different from the start. Their first meeting had been purely coincidental, an unexpected conversation at a business conference she had almost skipped. She had arrived late, slightly flustered, and found herself seated next to him at one of the networking tables. He had introduced himself casually, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that didn't demand attention but effortlessly commanded it. At first, she had barely noticed him, too focused on scanning the room for familiar faces, but as the evening unfolded, she found herself drawn in. His insights into business were sharp, his humor effortless, and when he spoke, it felt like he was letting her in on a secret the rest of the world wasn't privy to. They talked long after the event had ended, exchanging thoughts on ambition, success, and the sacrifices required to build something meaningful. When he finally asked for her number, Sophie hesitated for only a moment before giving it to him. There was no reason to hold back, she had told herself. At the very least, she had found an interesting friend. What started as casual conversations quickly turned into something more. Daniel had a way of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she needed. Their talk stretched into late nights, filled with laughter, deep reflections, and an ease that felt almost too good to be true. Sophie found herself looking forward to his messages, the sound of his voice, the way he spoke as if she were the only person in the world that mattered in that moment. He never rushed her, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. Their relationship unfolded naturally, like a story writing itself without force. She told Rachel about many things, work, new ideas, even her frustrations. But strangely, Daniel never came up in conversation. Not because she was hiding him, but because their friendship had always revolved around growth and success, not romantic entanglements. If Rachel noticed the shift in her mood or the sparkle in her eyes after a late-night call, she never asked. And Sophie never offered. It was a private joy, one she wasn't ready to share just yet. Months passed, and what had started as an unexpected connection had blossomed into something real. Daniel wasn't just a passing interest anymore. He was the man Sophie had unknowingly been waiting for. He made her feel safe, understood, cherished in a way she hadn't experienced before. When he finally told her he loved her, she had felt the words settle deep in her chest, anchoring her in place. Love had found her when she least expected it, wrapping itself around her like a quiet promise, and in that moment she had no reason to question it, no reason to doubt the man who had become her world. Rachel had always been attuned to Sophie's emotions, able to read the subtle shifts in her mood even when words weren't spoken. It was a skill that had come naturally over the years, honed through late-night brainstorming sessions and shared victories. Lately, though, Sophie had been different. There was a lightness to her, an unspoken joy that clung to her like the scent of fresh rain. Rachel noticed the way her friend's phone was never far from her hand, the way she seemed lost in thought, lips curling into a smile at odd moments. At first, Rachel dismissed it as work excitement, perhaps a new client or an ambitious idea Sophie hadn't yet shared. But as the weeks passed, it became evident that this change had nothing to do with their business. Something or someone had captured Sophie's attention in a way that was new, almost intoxicating. Yet Sophie never mentioned a name, never alluded to romance. Rachel considered pressing her for answers, but held back. If Sophie wanted to share, she would, and Rachel had never been the type to pry. The truth was, Sophie herself hadn't deliberately kept Daniel a secret. She simply never felt the urgency to bring him into conversations with Rachel. Their friendship had always centered around ambition, on pushing each other toward greatness, not on love and relationships. Besides, Daniel felt like a world entirely separate from the one she had built with Rachel, a space that was hers alone. The relationship had settled into a quiet rhythm, a comforting certainty that required no grand announcements. Sophie loved the way he made her feel, the ease of being with him without pretense. He wasn't just a man she was dating. He was someone who had seamlessly woven himself into her life, making her feel more complete than she ever thought possible. When he brought up the idea of marriage one evening over dinner, it didn't feel rushed or overwhelming. It felt right. She hadn't expected the proposal to come so soon, but as he held her hand across the table and spoke about a future together, Sophie realized she had already made her choice. She would say yes. She would build a life with him. Rachel, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, continued. Rachel had always found solace in routine. Mornings were for coffee and emails, afternoons filled with meetings, and evenings reserved for unwinding with a book or brainstorming with Sophie. It was a rhythm she had mastered, a structure that kept her grounded. But on an ordinary afternoon, as she made her way through the city's bustling park, her carefully built routine crumbled in an instant. She had been on a phone call, discussing an upcoming project, when something, or rather someone, stole her attention. Just a few steps ahead, seated on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, was Daniel. At first, she thought she was mistaken, but as he turned his head, catching sight of her, a slow smirk spread across his face, confirming the truth. Rachel's stomach tightened. It had been months since their night together, and she had convinced herself that it was nothing more than a fleeting mistake. Yet here he was, looking just as effortlessly composed as he had the last time she saw him, and the way he was looking at her sent a wave of unease creeping up her spine. He wasted no time striking up a conversation, slipping into the easy charm that had once drawn her in. Rachel told herself to keep it brief, to exchange pleasantries and walk away. But Daniel had a way of making words linger, drawing her into conversations that stretched longer than intended. They spoke about work, about life, and before she knew it, the sun was dipping lower in the sky. When he suggested they continue their conversation at her place, Rachel hesitated. The smart choice would be to say no, to end the encounter before old mistakes repeated themselves. But there was a pull between them, a thread of unfinished business that neither had severed. Against her better judgment, she found herself leading him home, convincing herself that it was nothing, just two old acquaintances catching up. But as the night unfolded, as conversation turned into something far more intimate, Rachel felt the weight of regret settle over her like an unforgiving shadow. When morning arrived, she awoke with a sinking feeling in her chest, realizing too late that she had allowed herself to be tangled in something she couldn't undo. Elsewhere in the city, Sophie moved through her day with a heart full of anticipation, blissfully unaware of the storm waiting to unravel her world. Daniel had asked her to meet him for dinner that evening, and she had a feeling, an unshakable certainty, that he was going to propose. She had replayed the moment in her mind countless times, picturing how he would do it, how she would react, how she would call Rachel afterward to tell her the news. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful, a future she had never dared to dream of until Daniel had come into her life. As she got ready for the evening, she had no idea that the man she loved had spent the previous night in the arms of the one person she trusted most. She had no idea that the happiness she was walking toward was already built on a betrayal waiting to be exposed. Sophie arrived at the restaurant earlier than planned, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the silver bracelet on her wrist. There was an undeniable excitement humming through her veins, an anticipation she could barely contain. The air was warm, the soft glow of the overhead chandeliers casting a golden hue across the intimate dining area. Every detail of the evening felt intentional, the reserved corner table with its candlelit setting, the soft melody of a violin playing in the background, the way Daniel had insisted she wear the dress he loved on her. This was it. She could feel it in the way he held her gaze, in the way he reached for her hand across the table with a touch that was both firm and reassuring. Sophie had always believed in the power of moments, and this was one she would remember forever. When Daniel finally got down on one knee, presenting a velvet box with a gleaming ring inside, her breath caught in her throat. It was everything she had imagined, everything she had hoped for. Without hesitation, she whispered the word he wanted to hear, yes. And just like that, she was engaged to the man she believed was her future. Across town, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, staring at the untouched glass of wine on her coffee table. A gnawing guilt had settled deep in her chest, a weight that refused to lift no matter how many times she told herself that what happened with Daniel had been a mistake. She hadn't planned for it, hadn't expected to fall back into old patterns, but the damage had already been done. The worst part was that Sophie had no idea. The thought made Rachel sick. Sophie, who trusted her more than anyone. Sophie, who had never once kept a secret from her. As much as Rachel wanted to believe she could bury the truth and move on, the uneasy feeling in her stomach told her otherwise. She reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating over Sophie's contact. Should she tell her? Confess before things spiraled out of control? But before she could decide, a notification flashed across her screen, Sophie's name, followed by a message that sent her world crumbling. He proposed. I can't wait to tell you everything. Rachel's throat tightened. It was too late. The lie had already been set in motion, and she was trapped in it. The following evening, Sophie insisted on meeting Rachel in person, unable to contain her excitement. Rachel listened in silence as her best friend gushed over every detail, the proposal, the way Daniel had looked at her, the plans they had already begun to make. Every word felt like a blade against Rachel's conscience, slicing through her resolve. She wanted to be happy for Sophie. She wanted to celebrate the way she deserved, but the weight of what she had done was suffocating. And then, as if fate had decided to intervene, a familiar voice interrupted their conversation. Rachel's blood ran cold as she turned to see Daniel approaching their table, completely unaware of the storm brewing in her mind. In that moment, as his eyes met hers and recognition flickered in them, Rachel knew the inevitable had finally arrived. The truth was no longer something she could hide, and when Sophie, beaming with happiness, gestured for Daniel to sit beside her, Rachel realized with a sinking heart that the moment she had dreaded was closer than ever. Rachel barely tasted her drink as she sat stiffly across from Sophie and Daniel, her hands curled tightly around the stem of her wineglass. The weight of the secret she carried pressed against her ribs, making it difficult to breathe. Every word Sophie spoke was filled with joy, every glance she cast toward Daniel brimming with love. Rachel wanted to look away, to excuse herself from the moment before the truth unraveled, but she knew she had already lost that chance. Daniel, however, remained composed, effortlessly slipping into conversation as if there were nothing out of place. His ability to conceal their mistakes so effortlessly sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Was she the only one drowning in guilt? The sound of Sophie's laughter rang through the air, a sound that had once been so familiar, so comforting, but now it felt like a cruel reminder of what Rachel was about to shatter. She could feel Daniel's gaze flicker toward her, a silent warning, a plea to keep quiet. But how much longer could she? The walls were closing in, the pressure becoming unbearable. The evening dragged on, each passing second an agony Rachel could barely endure. She tried to contribute to the conversation, tried to act as if everything was normal, but every time Daniel spoke, she felt her stomach twist. He was playing his part so effortlessly, speaking of the future with Sophie as if nothing had happened. Rachel watched him closely, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of regret. But there was none. Instead, there was confidence, a certainty that made Rachel sick to her core. Did he think she wouldn't say anything? Did he believe she would carry this secret for the rest of her life? As Sophie reached for Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently, Rachel felt her throat tighten. "I can't wait for you to be by my side through this journey," Sophie said, her eyes gleaming with sincerity. The words stung more than Rachel could bear. How could she stand by Sophie's side, knowing what she had done? Knowing that the man she was engaged to had spent the night with her just days before. The air in the room suddenly felt suffocating. She needed to get out. She needed space to think, to breathe, to decide what to do before it was too late. But fate had a way of forcing the truth out when least expected. Just as Rachel stood to excuse herself, Daniel's phone buzzed loudly against the table. He reached for it quickly, but not before Sophie's curious gaze flickered toward the screen. Rachel saw the way Sophie's expression shifted, confusion knitting her brows together. "Who's that?" Sophie asked, her tone light but laced with something deeper. Daniel hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Rachel to see it. Sophie must have seen it too, because she reached for his phone before he could react. A single name flashed across the screen: Rachel. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel felt her heart stop as Sophie turned toward her, eyes wide with confusion and something else, something darker. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie had already connected the dots. A sharp breath left her lips, her face paling as realization set in. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if denying the truth would make it disappear. But Rachel knew it was too late. The lie was unraveling, and nothing could stop the fallout that was about to come. The air between them turned thick with unspoken words, suffocating in its intensity. Sophie sat frozen, her fingers still wrapped around Daniel's phone, the name Rachel glaring at her from the screen like an accusation she couldn't ignore. Rachel's mouth went dry, her body rigid as she watched a storm brew behind Sophie's eyes. A single moment stretched into eternity, the weight of realization settling over the table like a heavy fog. Daniel reached for the phone, but Sophie jerked her hand away, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Why is Rachel calling you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the demand in it was undeniable. Rachel opened her mouth, searching for the right words, but there were none. Nothing could soften the betrayal. Nothing could undo the damage that had already been done. Daniel, ever the master of control, tried to reclaim the situation. "It's nothing, babe. She probably just..." But Sophie wasn't listening. She turned to Rachel, her expression shifting from confusion to something far worse, hurt. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on between you two?" Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, the walls of the restaurant pressing in on her. Every escape route vanished, every lie she could have told crumbling beneath the weight of Sophie's stare. She had never seen her best friend like this, raw, exposed, teetering between hope and devastation. And for the first time, Rachel saw herself through Sophie's eyes, not as a friend, not as a sister, but as a betrayer. The guilt, the shame, the suffocating burden of her choices bore down on her. "Sophie, I never meant for this to happen," Rachel started, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. She saw Sophie's body tense, her breaths coming faster, her mind putting together the puzzle pieces Rachel had tried so desperately to scatter. Daniel, for all his smoothness, was silent now, watching the unraveling with careful calculation, like a man trying to decide whether to run or fight. And then, as if Sophie could no longer bear the weight of silence, she spoke, her voice barely holding together. "Did you sleep with him?" The question hung between them, and in that moment, Rachel knew there was no running from the truth. With a deep, shuddering breath, she whispered, "Yes." Sophie shot to her feet so quickly that her chair screeched against the floor. Several heads turned in their direction, but she didn't care. Betrayal radiated from her in waves, her entire body shaking as she looked between Rachel and Daniel, as if seeing them for the first time. Rachel wanted to reach for her, to beg for her forgiveness, but she saw it in Sophie's eyes. Something had shattered between them, something that could never be put back together the same way. "You were supposed to have my back," Sophie choked out, tears threatening to spill. "You were supposed to be my sister." The pain in her voice was unbearable. Rachel had imagined this moment countless times, had agonized over what would happen when the truth finally came out, but no amount of guilt could have prepared her for the reality of Sophie walking away, her shoulders stiff, her hands clenched at her sides. The emptiness that followed was immediate and consuming, a void that Rachel knew could never be filled. And as Daniel sat there, still trying to find the right words to salvage the wreckage she had created, Rachel realized the truth. She had lost Sophie. Maybe forever. The evening air outside was thick with the scent of damp earth, but inside Sophie's apartment, it was suffocating. Rachel sat on the couch, her hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Across from her, Sophie paced, arms folded, her face a storm of emotions she was barely holding back. The weight of what had been revealed hung between them like a blade suspended in midair, ready to drop at any moment. Rachel had imagined 1,000 ways this conversation could go, but nothing prepared her for Sophie's silence. It was worse than shouting, worse than accusations. It was the kind of quiet that spoke of wounds too deep for words. Sophie finally stopped, inhaling sharply as she turned to face Rachel. "I trusted you," she whispered, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "I told you things I never told anyone, and all this time, you were hiding this from me?" The crack in her voice was like a dagger to Rachel's heart. She wanted to speak, to explain, but there was nothing she could say that wouldn't make it worse. She had betrayed her best friend in the most unforgivable way. And now, Sophie wasn't just angry, she was grieving. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't planned, Sophie. I never wanted to hurt you." The words felt useless the moment they left her mouth. Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You never wanted to hurt me?" Do you even hear yourself? She took a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the dining table as if steadying herself. You had every chance to tell me. Every time we sat together, every time we talked about our futures, our goals, you had the chance to be honest. And you didn't. The truth of that stung more than Rachel wanted to admit. She had let the lies pile up, had convinced herself that silence was better than confession. But now, looking at Sophie's face, at the sheer devastation in her eyes, she knew she had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. I didn't know how, Rachel admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. I was scared of losing you. Sophie's laugh was hollow, her eyes flashing with something close to fury. And yet, here we are. A sharp knock at the door cut through the tension like a knife. Rachel stiffened, but Sophie didn't move, her expression unreadable. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and Rachel had a sinking feeling in her stomach. Sophie exhaled through her nose, her body rigid as she finally turned and yanked the door open. And there he was, Daniel. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, his hands in his pockets, his usual composed expression flickering with something unreadable. Sophie, he started, but she held up a hand, her gaze as cold as steel. Don't, she said sharply. Don't you dare stand there and act like you have anything to say that I want to hear. Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Sophie's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. You took something from me that I can't get back. And for what? Your own selfishness? Rachel felt her breath catch as Sophie turned back to face her. There was no more anger in her eyes, just exhaustion. You need to leave, Sophie said softly, but there was finality in her tone. And as Rachel stood, feeling the weight of her own mistakes pressing against her chest, she realized something terrible. She had lost Sophie, but she had also lost herself. The days that followed felt like moving through thick fog, with Rachel caught between regret and an unbearable silence that stretched between her and Sophie. She had sent messages, long, apologetic ones at first, then short, desperate ones when those went unanswered. Sophie had read them all, but never responded. The realization that their friendship, once unbreakable, now dangled by a fragile thread, was something Rachel struggled to accept. She replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, wondering if she had said the wrong thing, if there had been one last moment where she could have salvaged their bond before it shattered completely. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about what she said or didn't say. It was about the trust she had broken, the years of shared dreams and loyalty that she had tainted. The pain of losing Sophie felt almost physical, like a dull ache in her chest that refused to fade. And then, just as she thought things couldn't get any worse, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, Daniel stood there, looking as if he too had been swallowed by regret. Rachel's first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the exhaustion in his eyes, or maybe it was the fact that, despite everything, she needed answers. She stepped aside, letting him in, though the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. I didn't come to make excuses, Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. I need you to know that I never planned for this to happen. Rachel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. That's the problem, Daniel. None of us planned for this, but we let it happen anyway. She could see the guilt written all over his face, but it wasn't enough. Nothing he said could change the damage that had been done. Did you love her? She asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Daniel hesitated, and in that pause, Rachel felt another piece of her heart break. I cared about her, he admitted, but I didn't realize how much until it was too late. The weight of his words settled between them like an unbearable burden. Rachel wanted to scream at him, to tell him that caring wasn't enough, that he had destroyed something beautiful, but the truth was, she had played a part in it too. Just as Rachel opened her mouth to respond, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. It was Sophie. After days of silence, she was finally reaching out. But when Rachel opened the message, her stomach dropped. It wasn't an apology or an attempt to mend their friendship. It was a link to a news article. Confused, Rachel clicked on it, her heart pounding as she read the headline. Wanted man accused of multiple robberies identified as Daniel Collins. Her blood ran cold as she scrolled down, her fingers trembling. There was his face, staring back at her from a security camera still, the grainy image capturing a side of him she had never known. She looked up at Daniel, who had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists. "Rachel, listen to me," he started, but she took a step back, her mind racing. Everything else, her betrayal, Sophie's heartbreak, their ruined friendship, suddenly felt small in comparison to the terrifying truth now staring her in the face. She had let herself fall for a man she never truly knew, and now it was too late to turn back. Rachel's hands trembled as she gripped her phone, rereading the headline over and over again, hoping she had misunderstood. But the words didn't change. The photo didn't disappear. Daniel, the man she had fought for, the man who had come between her and Sophie, was a wanted criminal. Her chest tightened as she turned to face him, her pulse hammering in her ears. The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. Daniel took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable, but Rachel instinctively took a step back, her body screaming at her to put distance between them. "Rachel, don't believe everything you see in the news," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I can explain." But Rachel's mind was already racing, piecing together details she had once ignored, his sudden disappearances, the way he always avoided talking about his past, the uneasy feeling she sometimes got but dismissed as paranoia. Now, everything made sense, and it made her stomach churn. She shook her head, gripping the edge of the table for support. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All this time, you weren't just hiding things from Sophie, you were hiding from the world." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might deny it. But then his shoulders sagged, and he exhaled sharply. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. "I made mistakes, Rachel, but it's not what it looks like." The desperation in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man she had trusted wasn't capable of what the news was saying. But how could she? The evidence was right in front of her. "Then tell me the truth," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Are you a criminal, Daniel?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And then, finally, he sighed. "I got involved with the wrong people," he admitted, his voice low. "I needed money, and I made choices I shouldn't have. But I never hurt anyone, Rachel. You have to believe that." She searched his face for sincerity, for something that would make this nightmare feel less real. But all she saw was regret. Deep, overwhelming regret. And that wasn't enough. "I can't do this," she muttered, shaking her head. "I can't be part of this." A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Rachel's breath hitched, fear gripping her like an iron fist. Daniel's eyes darted toward the entrance, his entire body tensing. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Rachel, it's me," Sophie's voice called from the other side, and relief flooded through her. Without hesitation, she rushed forward and unlocked the door, pulling it open. Sophie stepped inside, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. But the moment her eyes landed on Daniel, her face hardened. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. Daniel's eyes flicked between them, realization dawning on his face. "You called her," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really think I'd hurt you?" Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know what to think anymore." Sophie stepped forward, positioning herself protectively beside Rachel. "It's over, Daniel," she said. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for that moment, sirens blared from outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the window, and Daniel's face drained of color. "Rachel, please," he whispered, but she stayed silent. And as the police stormed in, pinning him to the ground, she realized this was the end of whatever illusion she had been living in. The police officers moved swiftly, their voices sharp and commanding as they restrained Daniel. The weight of the situation pressed down on Rachel, making it hard to breathe. She stood frozen, watching as the man she had once trusted was forced to the ground, his wrists locked in cold metal cuffs. His eyes darted to her, searching, pleading, but she felt nothing but a hollow ache in her chest. Sophie stood beside her, unwavering, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. "It's over," Sophie murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Rachel exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around herself. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. As the officers pulled Daniel to his feet, one of them turned to Rachel. "Do you wish to give a statement?" he asked. Rachel's throat felt dry, but she managed a nod. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had spent so much time trying to understand Daniel, trying to justify his actions, but now she saw things clearly. No amount of regret could erase what he had done. He had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. After the police left, taking Daniel with them, the apartment felt eerily silent. Rachel sank onto the couch, exhaustion washing over her. Sophie remained standing, arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. The weight of everything they had been through hung between them like an unspoken burden. Rachel finally looked up, meeting Sophie's gaze. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice raw with emotion. Sophie exhaled, her posture softening. "I know," she admitted, stepping closer. "And I never wanted us to end up like this." A lump formed in Rachel's throat. The pain of their fractured friendship had been unbearable, but now, in the aftermath of everything, she realized just how much she had missed Sophie. They had been through too much to let one mistake tear them apart forever. "Can we fix this?" Rachel asked hesitantly. Sophie studied her for a long moment before nodding. "We can try," she said. And for the first time in weeks, Rachel felt the smallest flicker of hope. Days passed, and the storm that had threatened to destroy them slowly began to settle. The news about Daniel spread quickly, his crimes becoming the center of attention. People whispered, speculated, but Rachel and Sophie chose to move forward, focusing on rebuilding what had been broken. They met with their families, talking openly for the first time in what felt like forever. Their parents had been the ones to remind them of what truly mattered, not the mistakes, not the betrayals, but the bond they had once sworn would never break. And so, they chose to heal. Not overnight, not easily, but with time and understanding. Their business thrived, growing stronger with every lesson they had learned. More importantly, their friendship, though scarred, began to mend, piece by piece. They weren't the same people they had been before Daniel, but maybe that was okay. Maybe, in the end, the real lesson wasn't about who had won or lost, but about standing by each other when everything else crumbled. And as they sat together one evening, laughing over something trivial, Rachel realized something. They had always been meant to watch each other's backs. And this time, they wouldn't let anything come between them again. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.